Today, 23rd April, we continue to get news from the Ukrainian battlefronts, which suggests that the situation continues to deteriorate in the main area where the fighting is taking place. And we've had more information about the situation in the village of Ocheretino, north of Avdiivka, which it is generally acknowledged is a major striking point, a key target for the Russians, a linchpin in what is left of the increasingly threadbare Ukrainian defenses in this area. Now, late last night, after I did my program, we started to get reports that the Russians had actually captured Ocheretino, which were rather astonishing reports, given that the Russians had only just reached Ocheretino a short time ago, and given the acknowledged importance of this position, one would assume that an attempt had been made to fortify it and to defend it. Well, I'm not sure that Ocheretino has been entirely captured by the Russians. In fact, reports that I'm seeing this morning suggest that the Russians may control perhaps 50 to 70% of Ocheretino. A deep state map, which is a Ukrainian-aligned project, puts it lower at around 30%. But anyway, that there's some kind of major Russian advance in Ocheretino seems indisputable, and it does look as if the Russians have reached the central part of this village, and even deep state map seems to show large parts of the village which are not yet under Russian control in the grey zone, which, considering that the Russians are advancing, looks like the Russians are going to the Russians are going to capture this territory as well. So one way or another, it looks as if the Russians, even if they haven't fully gained control of Ocheretino yet, are likely to do so at some point over the next few days, or perhaps even hours. And that is astonishing. But what is perhaps even more astonishing, or perhaps what is even more significant, is that we're now getting information about what exactly happened in Ocheretino that caused this situation. And, well, it's a story of a Ukrainian collapse. Now, there's been an account of this from Dima at the Military Summary channel, which is the one I'm going to basically follow in this program. But it's what Dima said in the Military Summary channel is very close, or seems to be very close, to what others are saying. And a lot of this apparently is confirmed also from Ukrainian sources. So anyway, this is, to the best sense that I can understand it, basically what happened, which is that the Russians arrived up close to Ocheretino. The brigade that was tasked with defending Ocheretino, which is the 115th Brigade of the Ukrainian military, then broke and fled and abandoned their positions under massive Russian artillery fire and airstrikes. The Ukrainian command then hurriedly redeployed the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which was withdrawing from Berdichi and which had been promised that it would be refitted in the rear. They hurriedly redeployed the 47th Mechanized Brigade to Ocheretino to stabilize the situation. The 47th Mechanized Brigade then arrived in the area of Ocheretino, but refused to redeploy into the village. They said that the situation was irretrievable. And besides, they had been fighting for the better part of a year now. They were deployed onto the front lines on the 4th of June of 2023. in support of the Ukrainian offensive that took place in the summer. They've been fighting, in other words, almost continuously since then. They're exhausted, and they're not really in a position to keep fighting further, and that they demand and insist that their promised withdrawal to the rear to refit and rest this time be carried out. And in the face of that, the Ukrainian military command was obliged to withdraw the 47th Mechanized Brigade from the area of Ocheretino and from the defense of this village. And then Ukraine sought to deploy another brigade to the same area to try to stabilize the situation in Ocheretino. I've not been able to find the identity of this brigade. This brigade also then arrived on the scene, took a look at the situation, and they said that they're not going into Ocheretino, that the place is impossible to defend, that the Russians are already in firm control of the greater part of it, that it would be a one-way suicide mission if they were sent into Ocheretino. And the result was that without any Ukrainian force to defend Ocheretino, the defense there has, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. I say that, I suspect that there are Ukrainian troops still in the village. Unclear how many they are or from which brigade, but it does look, if all of this information is correct, that the Russians are indeed on the brink of capturing Ocheretino. Now, I have to say, if all this information is correct, and as I said, it does seem to be consistent with what various parties are saying, then there's been insubordination on the part of three brigades of the Ukrainian army. The 115th Brigade, which retreated without orders from Ocheretino, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which refused to take its place, and another brigade which refused to take the place of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. This coming after information that there was a significant surrender of troops from the 25th Airborne Brigade, which has been disbanded, that the 67th Brigade, which was defending in Chasiv Yar and which is built around the right sector, far-right political group, that it's been disbanded as well after it too took the decision to retreat from its positions without orders. And now it looks as if this has spread to three brigades in the critical Avdiivka sector, one of them being the exhausted but presumably elite 47th Mechanized Brigade. Well, perhaps it's too much to say that this is all symptomatic of the collapse of the Ukrainian army. It's not yet clear that all of these soldiers are simply giving up the battle. But if all of these reports are true, it does speak of a deepening malaise, one which perhaps has been intensified by the recent change of command with the removal from his post of General Zaluzhny, the former overall commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, and his replacement by the unpopular General Syrskyi, who is, as we all know, Russian. On the topic of General Zaluzhny, there is a really rather strange report circulating. Again, I don't know how true this is, but the report says that the announcement that he has been appointed ambassador to Britain is a fake, that Zaluzhny has never agreed to take up that post, and that in reality he has never left Ukraine and is in a state of house arrest. Now, that may be fake news. I mean, I don't know whether that is the case or not, but certainly it is the case that we've seen very little, in fact, nothing from General Zaluzhny for a while now. And if he is indeed in London, well, I'm not aware of him having done very much whilst he's here, or indeed anything at all. Just saying. So, anyway, it could be that we are starting to look at growing war weariness and exhaustion by Ukrainian soldiers, that they're starting to doubt all the promises of victory and all the promises of aid and support from the West, that they're becoming increasingly concerned to preserve their own lives rather than obey what seem to them to be suicide orders, and that they're making decisions, and entire brigades are starting to make decisions by themselves, indicating a breakdown in the chain of command. Now, all of this is a little, as I said, it's not, as I said, all completely reliable. It could be that this description of events, though, as I said, it's coming from multiple sources, might be it might be that things are a little less dramatic than this makes them out to be. And it is certainly the case that in some places the Ukrainian army does appear to be still resisting, and resisting resolutely. But anyway, that's the reports that we're hearing from Ocheretino. Now, one other brigade is starting to say some rather similar things. And one gets the sense that these comments are now coming not from the official leadership of this brigade, which is the 79th Brigade, which was defending Novomykolaivka, which the Russians captured a day or so ago, but that these complaints are not coming from the officers who lead this brigade, but from the soldiers, the actual soldiers, the frontline soldiers who have been fighting, and who have been fighting in Novomykolaivka. And it again is somewhat consistent with this sense of a general malaise now starting to take hold in the Ukrainian army. Well, specifically, what these reports from this brigade, or the soldiers of this brigade, are telling us is that they were bravely resisting in the western part of Novomykolaivka until a few days ago. And then suddenly they stopped receiving supplies. And it wasn't just supplies of weapons and ammunition. They were not getting supplies of food or water or cigarettes or any of the other things that they needed in order to keep fighting. And the result was that the non-commissioned officers who were commanding the troops in Novomykolaivka, the actual NCOs, the sergeants who were actually in Novomykolaivka, as I discussed before, the Ukrainian army has adopted the American system of keeping the officers in the rear and relying heavily on non-commissioned officers to actually lead the men in battle, something which the Russian army doesn't do, and which I suspect a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who are still very much accultured to the Russian way of doing things probably don't entirely understand or approve of. Anyway, the point was that these sergeants who were fighting in Novomykolaivka, leading the men in Novomykolaivka, felt abandoned by their officers, by the command of the 79th Brigade, And again, they took the decision to withdraw from the western part of Novomykolaivka into their own hands. And the sergeants ordered the retreat from Novomykolaivka, and Novomykolaivka was abandoned to the Russians, or at least the western parts of Novomykolaivka was abandoned to the Russians, and the sergeants who carried out this unauthorized withdrawal were then immediately arrested by the Ukrainian authorities. Again, another sign perhaps of an unauthorized retreat by the increasingly disaffected and exhausted men of a Ukrainian brigade. And of course, they're claiming that they were fighting in Novomykolaivka heroically. They made claims that they destroyed, as I said, 300 Russian armored vehicles over the course of the fighting for Novomykolaivka. As I said, a wildly exaggerated claim, but the sort of claim that you would expect soldiers who just suffered a defeat to make and to cling to. They are suggesting that Novomykolaivka, the western part of Novomykolaivka, could still have been held, which anybody who looks at the map and is aware of the overall situation knows was impossible. The point is that they're blaming their officers and the Ukrainian command for their defeat and for the arrest of their sergeants. So, perhaps a further sign of growing despondency and malaise amongst the Ukrainian troops, of the Ukrainian troops on the ground. Now, as I said, we don't know quite what this is going to lead to. Syrskyi, in particular, has a reputation for being a harsh disciplinarian. He almost certainly will take fierce action to try to restore control and bring discipline, bring the soldiers back in line. But of course, there's always a risk when one takes draconian action of this kind, that it proves counterproductive and that, in fact, far from stabilizing a situation, it might lead to more disaffection and more anger and accelerate and spread the anger and disaffection across the military, leading to more problems. I remember a few weeks ago, in the immediate aftermath of Avdiivka's fall, I received a report from an extremely reliable source that there was growing anger and disaffection within something like a dozen Ukrainian brigades. And, well, maybe we are starting to see manifestations of this from the reports of the behavior of these various brigades that I'm talking about. Anyway, let's move on and let's discuss quickly what is happening in Ocheretino, and the place around Ocheretino is, as I said, increasingly the main position that the Russians seem to be rapidly in the process of capturing. There's reports also this morning that the Russians have sent troops south from Ocheretino, the part of Ocheretino that they now control, and from the east, from the area of the railway to the south of Ocheretino, that they sent troops to storm the village of Novomykolaivka, and I believe there's another village, and I believe its name is Solovyova, but I may be completely wrong, that the Russians are in the process of storming these two villages as well. And suffice to say, if these two villages are captured and Ocheretino is captured, the long battle of Berdichi, presumably now being fought by whatever Ukrainian troops are still left, either in the fields immediately to the north and west of Berdichi, or perhaps still placed in Berdichi itself, troops from whatever unit in this area has replaced the 47th Brigade, which was defending Stepovoye and Berdichi basically since October. Anyway, if all of these villages fall, Ocheretino, Novomykolaivka, Solovyova, if that's the correct name of this village, then the long and the short of it is that Berdichi, the battle there is finished. Any troops who are still there are going to be encircled. And that would mean, incidentally, the complete stabilization by the Russians and of their front lines north of Avdiivka, the total collapse of Ukrainian defense lines north and, by the way, west of Avdiivka as well. Ukrainian defenses in Umanskoy, Yasnobrodovka, and Netalovo would be certain to collapse in that case as well, with the Russians beyond the various water barriers. And on top of that, we've had more reports of the Russians now clearing Novokalinovka and Keramik, these two villages to the east of Ocheretino. So, as I said, the Russians would control an important block of territory north of Avdiivka. With control of Ocheretino, they would be in control of the high ground and elevation that apparently would enable them to observe the entire surrounding landscape. There are no proper defense lines in any direction beyond Ocheretino that the Ukrainians have yet been able to put together. And all sorts of possibilities open up for the Russians. They could advance northwest towards Pavlograd, encircling potentially the Ukrainian troops in Donbass. They could advance towards Pokrovsk. They could advance in all kinds of directions. And perhaps they will indeed advance in all of them. And, well, perhaps because of the dramatic events that have been happening in Ocheretino, we've had less news from other places about the fighting in Krasnogorovka, for example. But I've already said that it seems to me that the Russians are well on the way to capturing this town. And with the fall of Novomykolaivka, they're well on the way to capturing more territory to the west, the villages of Georgievka and Konstantinovka. They would be well positioned to launch an attack towards Kurakhovo, and also to cut the supply lines towards the village, towards the town, the fortified town, which I have been mispronouncing it apparently. I've been provided with an enormously helpful explanation of the correct pronunciation of this town. Anyway, either Vuchlidar, if you take the Ukrainian pronunciation, or Uglidar, if you give it the Russian pronunciation. For the moment, I'm going to stick to the Ukrainian. So Vuchlidar will rapidly become undefendable and will fall, and I've already discussed how that would lead to the collapse of Ukrainian defenses, not just in southern Donbass, but in my opinion, along the entire southern lines, the southern defense lines. So, a massive crisis for the Ukrainians in this area in central Donbass, with potential major impact on the area in southern Donbass as well, one which could also lead to the collapse of Ukrainian defense lines further to the southwest, in Zaporozhye, in places like Orekhov, and ultimately Zaporozhye city. And also, we're getting bits and bobs of news from the Chasov Yar area, where the Russians recently captured the village of Bogdanovka. The Russians have been heavily bombing the micro-district. It's likely that we're going to have a Russian offensive to clear Chasov Yar fairly soon, once the pounding of the micro-district and of Chasov Yar is concluded. This is all very reminiscent, I have to say, of the battles of Avdiivka and before that of Bakhmut. The collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Chasov Yar and any potential Russian advance from Ocheretino would put the Russians in a position where they could encircle Ukrainian troops and link up their forces from the Bakhmut area and from the Avdiivka area to form a unified front line. That might, by the way, explain the recent decision by the Russians to do away with the directions and to focus instead on the actions of the groups of forces, which I discussed in yesterday's video. Well, if all of this happens, as I said, we're looking at the beginning of the end of the Battle of Donbass, and in my opinion, of the entire battle east of the Dnieper River. And here I'm going to come back to the information that I'm getting from my various sources, and one in particular, because we're now getting an awful lot of information about the aid that the United States intends to send to Ukraine. There's been some talk that a large amount of equipment has been forward deployed in Poland for some time and will be rushed to Ukraine as soon as the Senate has approved the bill that was passed, the appropriations bill passed by the House of Representatives, and also President Biden has signed it. All of that process expected to conclude over the course of today, quite likely will have been concluded by the time you watch this program. Anyway, once that's done, this pile-up of equipment in Poland, close to the Polish border, is going to be rushed to Ukraine. And we've been shown some pictures of some of the equipment that is being assembled. And there's lots of pictures of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Now, this is something of a surprise. We've been getting reports for some time that Ukraine is short of infantry fighting vehicles. An interesting admission, by the way, that the Russian campaign to destroy Ukrainian armored vehicles has been successful. The United States does not have the means to replace all the armored vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicles and armored vehicles that Ukraine has lost, nor, by the way, do the European powers. Whatever numbers of Bradleys the United States sends to Ukraine cannot replace these losses. But it does look as if the United States does intend to supply infantry fighting vehicles, which is a little surprising given that there's been so much talk recently that the priority need for Ukraine at this moment in time is artillery, shells, drones, and long-range missiles and air defense missiles. And this is where we come back to that report about those 60 US advisors that have been rushed to Ukraine. Now, Dima on the Military Summary Channel suggested that these were special forces troops intended to act as a bodyguard unit for President Zelensky at a time when President Zelensky is coming in for increasingly bitter criticism from people like Dmytro Yarosh, the head of Right Sector, and at a time when the Ukrainian army is suffering major defeats on the battlefronts, and also, of course, at a time when his constitutional term of office is due to end shortly in the middle of May. Well, a report that I've seen from this source, which I consider to be very reliable, suggests that these are not actually that kind of special forces, that it is not, in other words, a bodyguard unit. Basically, they are engineers, and the idea is to try to use these engineers to help to create fortified lines. And the fortified lines that it is envisaged will be created will be on the west bank of the Dnieper. In other words, Ukraine is fighting at the moment for time. The Western powers understand that they do not have the resources to help Ukraine turn the situation in East Bank Ukraine, Left Bank Ukraine, as it is sometimes called. In other words, in Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, that the plan is indeed to conduct some kind of a fighting retreat, ultimately to the west bank of the Dnieper, to retreat into that iron triangle of cities, Zaporozhye, Dnipro, Kryvyi Rog, and to try to hold out there. That is now the plan. And all of this, apparently, combined with another plan to use long-range missiles and drones, Storm Shadows, perhaps eventually Taurus missiles, but obviously, first and foremost, ATACMS missiles to try to cause more damage to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, to try to basically drive the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea. An impossible objective, in my opinion, from every point of view. But anyway, some people in the West continue to cling to that idea. Now, I have already expressed my own skepticism about this plan, but there are lots of bits and bobs of information which suggest that it might indeed be the plan which we see play out. In other words, a fighting retreat to the west bank of the Dnieper, an attempt to embed there, and perhaps going back to those earlier reports, those assertions, those comments by President Macron, to try to reinforce Ukrainian defenses on the west bank of the Dnieper with NATO soldiers, French soldiers in Odessa, Polish soldiers in other places, the British sending what is left of their army someplace as well, and with the F-16s, once they eventually arrive, also being deployed to try to provide air cover for all of these troops. Anyway, there we go. That might be the plan. There are, as I said, fundamental problems with it. The first problem is that if we're talking about the entirety of West Bank Ukraine, we would not be talking about an economically viable entity. If Western Ukraine, Lvov and the areas around it, were to break away and form a breakaway state, well, that might just about be viable, though of course it would not have access to the sea, but it would be relatively small and relatively contained, and it might just about be able to function. But if we're talking about Kiev, then loss of access to the Dnieper, which is what this plan envisages, would deprive Ukraine of a key artery. It would mean that the Ukrainian cities, the big industrial cities, strung out along the Dnieper, would be desperately vulnerable to Russian artillery fire. And, well, to be straightforward about this, in the absence of a proper negotiated ceasefire, it's difficult to see how they could function, and deprived of their of the area around them, their economic basin, if you like, they would probably gradually die, economically die. So I'm not sure that this is actually a viable plan. Again, we come up against this problem that Western governments, Western leaders, do not seem to have a very good grasp, not just of military strategies and industrial strategies, but of basic facts about economic geography and indeed human geography altogether. But anyway, that perhaps does make some sense of all of these decisions. But there's a few further points I will make. This pile-up of equipment on the eastern border of Poland strongly suggests that the United States, that the Biden administration, is going to send as much equipment within the amount of the $14 billion military allocation to Ukraine as it can now. In other words, that the support, this military support from this appropriation, is going to be front-loaded. Again, obviously, with the objective of staving off a collapse before the November election, and perhaps of stabilizing the situation on the west bank of the Dnieper before then. Now, front-loading an assistance package in that kind of way, and bear in mind the point that has been made, that I made in my program yesterday, that it is very likely, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou pointed out on the Duran in a program that we did, that to a certain extent, most, or at least a significant part of this appropriation, closes positions on equipment that has already been allocated. Anyway, the risk that is run is that if all of this equipment is supplied to Ukraine now, leaving little left in the appropriation to supply more, then, given the rate at which Ukraine burns up equipment, this equipment could also be burned up very fast, in which case the administration will be left once again in a few weeks' time in a similar situation where there is another crisis in supply for Ukraine, and it's again run out of money to provide more. Now, given the immensely bitter feelings within the Republican Party about the way in which the appropriation was passed, and I've now seen conclusive figures about the final vote, and it is clear that a majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives voted against the $61 billion appropriation. I said in a previous video that I thought a majority had voted for it. It's now clear that a majority voted against it. This despite the fact that it is now apparently confirmed that former President Donald Trump, the Republican candidate for the presidency in the forthcoming election, quietly backed Speaker Johnson's decision to move forward with the appropriation, despite the failure to find funds for the border. In fact, there's a widespread view, which, by the way, I share, that it was actually Donald Trump who made the decision that this appropriation should be brought before the House and that Speaker Johnson complied. But, I'm not going to get into all of that. Well, given that even despite Donald Trump's quiet support for the appropriation, most Republicans in the House voted against it. And in the Senate, J.D. Vance is again arguing strongly against the appropriation as well. I suspect that if the White House comes back, say in August, and asks for still more money over and above the $61 billion that has already been provided, with the situation on the front lines deteriorating, well, the row that we're going to see in Congress this time will be on a scale that we have not seen. And of course, if members of the Republican conference move to depose Speaker Johnson, and if eventually the Democrats withdraw support from him, which I presume eventually they will, or if Speaker Johnson himself eventually comes to the view that having lost the confidence of a substantial block of Republicans, he cannot remain Speaker, then we could find ourselves in a situation midsummer where Congress lacks a Speaker. It would anyway, of course, be presumably on leave. At that time, it might prove impossible for the administration to provide more funding, to get the Congress to authorize more funding, and we could have an even bigger crisis before the election than the one we have had up to this point. Anyway, all of this is moving forward a bit, but the key point is that there does now seem to be a gradually dawning recognition that the battle for Ukraine east of the Dnieper has been lost. The Donbass is going to fall. Once Donbass falls, the rest of Ukraine east of the Dnieper will follow as well, at which point the Russians will take control of the whole of Ukraine east of the Dnieper. And then the question is whether the line of the Dnieper can be held as well, which perhaps it can for a while, but not, I think, indefinitely, without some kind of agreement with the Russians, which, to be frank, I don't think this administration would find it possible to negotiate. Anyway, there we go. That's it, all looking a bit far forward. But let's just return to that topic about the fact that the battle for eastern Ukraine, that there's a growing recognition that the battle for eastern Ukraine might indeed be lost. Now, I've been focusing on the fighting in Donbass, and I've been saying in many programs that there's much discussion, much debate about a Russian offensive coming, and much debate about how that Russian offensive might be focused on Kharkiv region. We'll come to what's happening there shortly. But the major hole that the Russians have punched through the front lines, the place where we're now seeing definite signs of a Ukrainian collapse, is central Donbass, with all of this information that Ukrainian brigades are increasingly refusing to obey orders, with Ocheretino perhaps captured by the time you're watching this program, or at least captured fairly soon, with the Russians able for the first time to conduct sweeping envelopment advances, creating cauldrons around Ukrainian troops caught between a Russian advance southwest from Chasov Yar and a Russian advance northwest from Ocheretino. So I've been focusing on that, but I think we can't wholly discount the possibility that the Russians might be planning something in Kharkiv region as well. We've had confirmation from the Russians that a group of forces north has also been created, which is a completely new group of forces that we knew nothing about before. There was this brief reference to it in a Russian Defense Ministry bulletin a few days ago. And we've had the major Russian attacks on Kharkiv, the destruction of the power stations around Kharkiv, the systematic destruction of the air defense systems around Kharkiv, the bombing by the Russian Air Force of Kharkiv, something which has never taken place at any other point during the war. And now, perhaps another major step, also suggesting that Kharkiv itself might be a target, and that is the destruction of Kharkiv's television tower. Now, I don't know to what extent television towers, big television towers, are part of the landscape in the United States. They are a very visible part of the landscape in Central and Eastern Europe. And that, by the way, also includes Germany as well. Most cities have them. They are an essential part of the television and communications system. Destruction of the television tower of Kharkiv doubtless does have an important military role. No doubt the Ukrainians had observation positions on the television tower. No doubt it was also being used by the Ukrainians as a communications part of their, as a key part of their communication system in this part of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. It's likely also that the Russians, by destroying the television tower, well, they won't have been unaware of the fact that it will impact on television transmissions to Kharkiv, and will therefore, on top of everything else that is happening, has been happening to Kharkiv, affect the lives of the citizens there. There are reports that the Ukrainians are increasingly worried about the situation in Kharkiv. There was even a report that I saw yesterday that the Ukrainians are deploying all available reserves to the borders with to the northern border in Kharkiv region. There are rumors or reports that the Russians have cleared the minefields on the border between Kharkiv region, between Belgorod region in Russia, of course, and Kharkiv region, all perhaps indicative of a potential Russian offensive. And now, of course, we've had this destruction of this television station, which will also have been very much a monument of the city of Kharkiv. Now, it could be, as some are speculating, that all of this is an elaborate ruse, that the Russians have no real plans to launch an offensive in the Kharkiv area, that Putin's earlier talk about a buffer zone involving Kharkiv has no reality to it, and that the Russians have no intention, therefore, of launching an offensive in Kharkiv region. That their major priority, their main line of advance, is going to be through central Donbass. They've now captured Avdiivka. They will soon capture Krasnogorovka. Pokrovsk is likely target, and Ocheretino is about to fall. And everything suggests that an advance in this area is in some respects the most fruitful one, and the one that is likely to achieve the most positive military outcomes for the Russians. But I suspect that Russian forces are now big enough and powerful enough for the Russians to be able to conduct major offensives in more than one direction. It's likely that they could push hard through this gap in the Ukrainian defenses that is emerging in central Donbass and still have more than enough troops for an offensive in Kharkiv region, capturing Kharkiv city itself, probably a massive and very complicated undertaking. But then again, what we don't know now is how resilient the Ukrainian defenses in Kharkiv would actually be. It may be that with so many Ukrainian troops having suffered so many losses in so many places, in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, in Bakhmut, in Mariupol before, in Avdiivka, in Chasiv Yar, that the available forces to defend Kharkiv are depleted and demoralized and might not be capable of mounting an effective defense of the city. And it's important to add that the Russian forces, which would be attacking Kharkiv, if such an attack were launched, would be of a completely different character and scale to the ones that were operating outside Kharkiv and Kiev in the first half of 2022. It wouldn't just be an armored force backed with very powerful artillery. It would be an armored force with vast numbers of drones, specialized troops trained in urban warfare, with drones that could carry out surveillance and could identify Ukrainian defense positions in Kharkiv, and of course backed by overwhelming air power and fab bombs and all that kind of thing. So, well, anyway, I'm not going to make predictions. I'm not the best person to make predictions. But for the record, I think that though perhaps the most important place for a Russian advance would indeed be central Donbass around Avdiivka, I think that there is too much accumulating evidence of a Russian offensive of some kind being planned in Kharkiv region for it to be possible to ignore it or to think that an offensive is not coming. Anyway, in summary, a terrible day for Ukraine. Not just Ocheretino about to fall, but reports now of many brigades becoming disaffected and refusing to fight. Indications that the latest American aid package could be a one-throw affair, that it might not be capable of being sustained over a long period, that there might not be enough money or resources to do it, and that the Americans intend to front load their aid package with the very real risk as a result that it will be burnt out very fast. Clear signs that the Russians are now preparing some kind of major offensive in Kharkiv region. Some reasons to think that the Russians might be planning some kind of envelopment in Donbass region. And also reason to think that the plan actually is, that the extent that the West has a plan, the plan actually is the plan I've discussed before, to accept the loss of the battle for eastern Ukraine and try to retreat to the west bank of the Dnieper and to defend what's left. Well, there we go. Let's now move on and discuss an entirely different question, because the United States government, as I discussed in my program yesterday, appears to be preparing a sanctions package against China's financial industry, its banks. And I said that the Chinese will certainly not comply with any demand from the United States to interrupt or reduce their trade with Russia, and that the Chinese anyway almost certainly calculate that the United States, one way or the other, is planning to sanction their banks, their financial system, to begin a sanctions war against China's financial system, and that the claim that the United States is doing it because of Chinese support for Russia is just a pretext for the United States to do that which it has always intended to do anyway: sanction China's financial system in order to prevent, or try to prevent, China from moving forward with its plans to set up an alternative global financial and trading architecture around the BRICS, independent from that operated through the dollar. Well, today we've had the Chinese response, and it is exactly as I would have predicted. We've had comments from China's the foreign ministry spokesman, and we've had two fierce articles in Global Times. One reads, and it's by Chen Xing, China slashes hypocritical move by US on Ukraine crisis ahead of Blinken's visit, urging Washington to end blame shifting. And we go on to read, China voiced the firm opposition to the hypocritical moves by the United States on the Ukraine crisis by enacting massive aid bills for Ukraine while making baseless accusations against the normal trade between China and Russia. And we are then told that Wang Wenbin, spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry told a press conference on Tuesday. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has not yet published its transcript of this press conference. But anyway, this is what Wang Wenbin said. On the one hand, the US enacts massive aid bills for Ukraine, and on the other, it makes baseless accusations against the normal economic and trade interactions between China and Russia, which is extremely hypocritical and irresponsible. China resolutely opposes this. And Global Times then goes on to tell us that on the issue of Ukraine, Wang said China has always maintained objective and fair stance, actively advocating for peace and promoting a political solution. China consistently controls the export of dual-use items in accordance with laws and regulations. China is not the creator or a party to the Ukraine crisis, does not add fuel to the fire, does not take advantage of the situation for gain, and does not accept blame shifting. China has the right to engage in normal economic and trade interactions with all countries in the world, including Russia, on the basis of equality and mutual benefit, a right that should not be interfered with or undermined. China's legitimate rights and interests must not be violated. And Global Times says that he then advised the United States that fanning the flames or shifting blame is not the correct way to resolve the issue in Ukraine. The only right choice is to take into account the reasonable security concerns of all parties and to establish a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security framework through dialogue and negotiation. Note that the Chinese have again said that the resolution of the crisis in Ukraine requires a renegotiation of the security architecture of Europe, which is, of course, the point that the Russians have also been making all along. And then the article from Global Times ends with the following words from Wang Wenbin. We hear that it says that he said that we strongly oppose the hypocritical behavior of the US, which fans the flames itself, yet shifts the blame on to China. China's right to engage in normal economic and trade interactions with all countries, including Russia, must not be violated. We will resolutely defend our legitimate rights and interests. And anyway, more of that in this article about what Wang Wenbin said, including the need for the United States to observe properly WTO rules. And alongside that article, we've had a ferocious commentary, also in Global Times, by Global Times staff reporters. In other words, this is an unsigned article, not exactly an editorial comment, that's probably on the way, but it's nonetheless a considered view from Global Times, which, to repeat, is owned by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of the Communist Party of China. And this article says US ratchets up pressure on China ahead of Blinken visit in typical hegemonic response. And the article goes on to say that US Secretary of State Blinken will reportedly warn that Washington will take punitive steps against Beijing over its weapon-related exports to China. Observers said the rhetoric, in addition to the recent hype of overcapacity, the word overcapacity in quotation marks, regarding exports of Chinese new energy product and numerous restrictions slapped on Chinese high-tech industries shows that the US has been ratcheting up pressure on China in a wider range of military, economic, and trade fields, which is a way of saying, making the same point, by the way, that I've made, that the Chinese see this threat of sanctions about China's alleged trade with Russia, support for Russia's war in Ukraine. The Chinese see this as simply a pretext to impose sanctions on China's financial industries that the United States is looking to impose anyway. And then the article goes on to say this, and this enlarges on this point, that this is actually all about an economic war being waged against China and has nothing really to do with Ukraine. The recent bizarre narratives, this is from Global Times, on China are all essentially disguises to justify the US weaponizing economic issues in order to shift the blame away from the Biden administration's policy failures. Whilst these moves are somewhat typical US tactics of aggression first and backing off later, analysts said the amassing of more Washington-instigated negative factors will create more discords in bilateral relations, which remain extremely fragile despite certain progress towards stabilization. If Washington is sincerely looking to ensure that bilateral relations stay the course, it should abandon its domineering approach and communicate with China on an equal footing. Otherwise, bilateral tensions are at the risk of escalating into a broader conflict. And we're also then told that Blinken does not plan to reveal what measures the United States will take during his visit to China, but several people familiar with the situation said it is considering sanctions on Chinese financial institutions and other entities. And Blinken's visit also comes after the approval of a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine by the US House of Representatives, as the Biden administration desperately attempts to cover up its inability to handle international issues ahead of the US presidential election, whilst blaming China for alleged military exports to Russia is simply an excuse in this regard. Anyway, a number of people have suggested, in fact, I've had one particular email about this, that what the United States may be intending to do is to cut off some Chinese banks from access to the SWIFT interbank payment system. That may be correct. It may be something as extreme as that. It's important to remember that China operates its own interbank payment system, as of course does Russia now, and that there's talk about linking these two systems, and there's also increasing talk of internationalizing these systems. Cutting off Chinese banks from SWIFT is an extremely dangerous step. It further undermines the global nature of SWIFT and would also mean that the United States would lose further track of international currency movements, which are already becoming increasingly invisible for the United States, especially since Russia was largely, although by the way, still not completely cut off from SWIFT as well. But anyway, it could also be that the administration for the moment is intending something less severe than this cut off of Chinese banks from SWIFT. That would be a massive operation, and given that SWIFT is a massive action, And given that SWIFT, of course, is a European entity administered by European law, it would require the agreement of the Europeans, which some of them, the German government and the French government, for example, might be reluctant to agree to. So the United States might impose other sanctions on Chinese banks. Options to do that do exist. Difficult to see how effective those other actions might be. But anyway, they might try to do something against these banks, which is, for the moment, less than the nuclear option of a cut-off of certain, probably at this moment, not all, Chinese banks from SWIFT. I have to say, though, that going back to that description that I once gave of the sanctions process as an escalatory escalator, the lesson that one has to take away from that is that once sanctions are imposed, it is politically all but impossible to remove them. And on the contrary, the less effective sanctions turn out to be, the more the pressure grows within the United States and within the European Union to escalate them. We have some examples of this now coming from the European Union. It seems the Swedish government, for example, is now campaigning to sanction Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers. A hopeless idea, by the way. I mean, all that would happen is that those tankers would simply change flags and would disguise themselves in all kinds of ways, even if they do transit the Black Sea. It's a completely unworkable idea, and one which I suspect that the administration, the US administration, anxious for the moment to keep oil flows stable, would not approve of. But anyway, Sweden is apparently now campaigning to sanction Russia's oil fleet, even though, were that ever to succeed, which it won't, it would lead to a reduction in global oil supplies and a rise in the price of oil, which would not benefit Western economies. Sweden is also apparently agitating to sanction and ban Russian LNG imports into the European Union. The United States wants the same to happen also, which will further exacerbate the energy problems within Europe. But we see how in Europe also the sanctions escalator simply goes on escalating. You can't get off without a catastrophic loss of political face, which political leaders find it impossible to accept, and which might, if done, lead most of the world to think that your sanctions weapon is actually hollow. So even if the United States stops short of disconnecting Chinese banks from SWIFT, as night follows day, at some point in the next few years, might take 5 years, might take 10 years, it might be next year, it might take longer, that step will probably be made. Unless, of course, there is a radical shift in the political environment in the United States, which is possible, but which I have to say, on the issue of China, for the moment, doesn't seem very likely to me. And I think the Chinese know it. And this is why they've been busy stockpiling gold and virtually everything else that they need to stockpile in preparation for the economic siege by the United States that they know is to come. Now, I should make it clear, I think that any attempts to interrupt or unbalance world trade, all that it will do in terms of Western economies is create major supply problems and put added upward pressure on inflation. Inflation numbers across the West are turning out to be stickier, in other words, higher than policy makers and forecasters had assumed. By the way, at the Duran, we have always been the exception to this. We've always assumed that this massive spending by the US government, deficit spending by the US government, was inherently inflationary. And we've also taken the view that this relentless sanctions war, by its disorganization of supply chains, is inflationary as well. Anyway, there are rumors that the Federal Reserve Board might now, instead of looking at interest rate cuts, might be obliged to consider interest rate increases. I have to say, I think that is extremely unlikely before the election. I think were it to happen before the election, it would mark a massive vote of no confidence in the Biden administration and its economic team. And I'm not going to even try to guess now what the economic and political consequences of that would be. And for that reason, I suspect the Fed and its board will desperately seek to avoid something like that happening. But anyway, all of these moves that the United States is doing or thinking of doing with respect to China can only add significantly to the inflationary pressures that are already barely under control. And of course, as inflation rises, the ability to keep the Western economies chugging along at their present rate of stagnation, with debt levels rising, well, that will simply become even more difficult than it already is. So it doesn't make sense. But of course, it makes even less sense with respect to an immediate problem. Now, obviously, if the United States starts to sanction China's financial institutions, the Chinese will respond by accelerating their push to create their own rival institutions in replacement to those of the United States. And I think that the US leadership does not understand how unpopular globally they have become, or the extent to which much, perhaps most of the world is now increasingly looking towards the BRICS and China. Suffice to say that even Colombia, the United States' most reliable ally in Latin America, and most long-standing ally in Latin America, under its current president, is apparently now seeking to join the BRICS. There's been a Colombia-Brazil summit, and President Lula of Brazil, infuriated apparently by Argentina's refusal not to join the BRICS following the election of President Milei. Anyway, Lula is now looking to get the Colombians to join instead. And suffice to say, the current Colombian government, or at least the president, seems interested in that idea. Anyway, I think the United States underestimates the extent to which, as I said, China today is becoming, for many countries, an attractive pole in place of a United States which is increasingly seen as a bullying and overbearing one. But put all that aside, there's also straightforwardly the economic factors, which is that China produces far more than the United States and the rest of the West does, and that it is indispensable in terms of global trade. And here we come back to another fundamental fallacy that exists about the Ukraine war. The historian Jeff Roberts has referred me to a recent article by Matthew Blackburn in Responsible Statecraft. I'd missed the article, by the way. So I'm grateful to Jeff Roberts for referring me to it. Anyway, this article is a very effective demolition job on the Institute for the Study of War, pointing out the extent to which the Institute of the Study of War has shaped Western understanding of the war in Ukraine, leading to many of the policy areas, the mounting policy areas we see today, and continuously advocates escalation and reduces everything in terms of the Ukraine war to a question of will, a question of willpower. Now, I've already talked about that previously, but I noticed at one point that Matthew Blackburn makes, which is absolutely correct, is that the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, again, returns to this perennial topic that Western economies in aggregate are much bigger than Russia's economy, and so it should be straightforward for the West to overwhelm Russia in Ukraine. All that is needed is the will to do it. Well, I've already discussed in many programs the fallacy of that, the extent to which it really doesn't address the issue of production and industry and industrial organization and all of those things. And Matthew Blackburn touches on that, and he also makes the completely valid point that there have been many cases in history where an economically weaker power has prevailed in a war against an economically stronger power. A classic example from modern history, by the way, is the war on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. The aggregate economic resources available to Germany at the time it attacked the Soviet Union in 1941 were much greater than those available to the Soviet Union. Germany at that time, as well as its own very big economy, controlled the entire economy of continental Europe. It should, in theory, therefore, have been able to overpower the Soviets economically and militarily, but of course it wasn't able to do so. But is it really the case that the West overmatches Russia in economic terms? Western commentators, the ISW, take the unity of the collective West for granted, but assume that they're up against an isolated Russia. They say that even as they complain about China's economic support for the Russian war effort. But just imagine if that economic support becomes real. Let's go back to what actually happened during the Second World War. The Soviets actually were able mostly to defeat the Germans on their own resources. But one of the major factors why the Allies collectively prevailed is because even though the Soviet Union and Britain, the two countries fighting Germany, did not have economic resources, or at least industrial resources, that would have matched Germany's in 1941, given German control of Europe. At the end of 1941, they were joined by the United States. The United States, in manufacturing and industrial terms, had a position in 1941 analogous to the one that China has today. And that enormous American industrial capacity, in the end, submerged Germany. Now, China is not, for the moment, directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine, but these actions by the United States and the collective West, making themselves ever more hostile to China, might eventually change that calculus. And, well, the Russians are probably going to win the war in Ukraine without any assistance from the Chinese. But of course, if the Chinese do start to provide real assistance, they will submerge the Ukrainians, just as American support in the 1940s submerged the Germans. But it goes beyond that, because Chinese industrial production would submerge not just the Ukrainians. In military terms, it could also submerge the collective West as well. This is a very, very high-risk gamble that the Americans are taking. I don't know that they understand the risks that they're taking on themselves. There's a famous quote attributed to the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who, after Pearl Harbor, that all that Japan had done was awaken a sleeping giant, and his anger would be terrible to behold. It seems to me that the Americans are running the risk with China of doing exactly the same thing. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Also, you can, of course, support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget, too, that you can check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a good day.